Thank you. Our next panel focuses on European economic trends and the investment climate post-Brexit. I'd like to call our moderator, Simon Kennedy, Chief Brexit Editor, Bloomberg News, and our guest speakers to the stage now, once the glasses have cleared. And we're privileged to have three notable experts join us in this conversation. So please welcome Stephen Adams, partner with Global Counsel, Andrew Benito, Senior European Economist with Goldman Sachs, and Rupert Harrison, the Chief Macro-Strategist of BlackRock. And Simon and guests, over to you.
Good afternoon. As we were saying, a great panel to discuss Brexit. Someone likened it today, or 2016, to a reality show, a political reality show, with a sense that last night we saw the season finale of the America TV series with a twist that few of us saw, many saw coming, but few actually called. And back here in Britain, we're occupied with the soap opera that is Brexit. So. Three great experts on these issues. I know in the advertising programme it talks about Brexit in Europe. It seems, though, that we probably have to at least talk about last night's news to some extent. And so I'm interested in kind of linking those, and perhaps, Stephen, you can start. What does Trump mean for the Brexit negotiation? Not looking to revisit the referendum or the parallels between Brexit and last night's result, but what does a Trump presidency perhaps, how does it affect those negotiations in 2017?
Well, I think a Trump win almost certainly exacerbates the sense among some in the EU 27 that they have a proof of concept question with respect to the UK and with respect to Brexit, that if the process of Brexit is perceived to be a success, if it is perceived to be something that is managed to the benefit of the UK, that they will essentially create a license for their domestic Eurosceptics. I think particularly in France, but in the Netherlands as well, inevitably they will be, mainstream politicians, governments will be looking at the domestic Eurosceptics and worrying that Trump represents a political contagion problem, and that's the way that they will go into the negotiation. I do think that there is another potential impact that we could see here, which is that if the US election result, if a messy transition period, if a kind of a sense of greater volatility from the states creates a sense of heightened risk around the launch of the Brexit negotiation, we might see some push to actually try and choreograph the triggering of Article 50 in the early phase of the negotiation a bit better, so as to make sure we're not straining market nerves. But if I was asked to pick one way or the other, I would say I'd be much more worried about the EU 27 seeing this as an even greater imperative to squeeze the UK hard and to try and contain domestic populism.
Rupert?
Yeah, I agree. I think the former of those is going to be far more powerful an incentive. I think also, we're now, everybody should be extremely sceptical of opinion polls, and therefore European leaders facing election over the next year are going to be even more focused on the risks in those elections than they were before, and Brexit will take second place or third place or fourth place in their attention. So it's going to be difficult to get traction over the next year with most of those senior leaders, particularly in France and Germany. But I totally agree. The main point is, if you listen to what Marine Le Pen, Geert Wilders, Mr. Grillo in Italy, what they say, the biggest bone that anyone could throw to them would be a successful Brexit, because then say we want the same thing for us, and therefore that is going to weigh very heavily on the minds of our counterparties in this negotiation.
So just to check, when you talk about the capitals focusing more on their domestic issues, does that mean that even if Theresa May invokes Article 50, or someone invokes Article 50 by the end of March, it'll be on the back burner for a while?
I think so. I think it's a sort of phony war until certainly the German election at least, so in the autumn, because I think this sort of united front that you now have from most European spokespeople that the freedoms are indivisible, the UK can't cherry pick. It's an open question whether that united front can ever be broken down, but there's certainly no prospect of it breaking down this side of the German election, because I can't see Angela Merkel saying anything else in public or in private.
Andrew, where do you see it?
Well, I think the most interesting element of this issue, this threat that comes from populism, whether you associate that with Brexit and or Trump's election victory, is how does Europe respond to this threat? And I think the key choice that Europe has by way of a response is, does it do more of the same, which is basically a little bit more fiscal easing, a little bit more of loosening the constraints on fiscal policy, partly by the ECB extending its asset purchases and buying space for that fiscal loosening, or do they actually do what Rupert's referring to, which is, do they open up the questions of four freedoms? Do they try and break it down to cater for that nativist element of populism, which would like to see Europe redefined from four freedoms into three freedoms? And my own view is quite clearly it will be the first of those two. It will be a little bit more the same. It will be a little bit more fiscal loosening and monetary easing.
But on the four freedoms, the rest of Europe has been pretty united.
Exactly, so they won't reopen that.
They won't reopen.
It will be the first response, which sees more fiscal loosening, more of a policy mix story, pretty standard macro approach, rather than opening those deep political commitments, which I think still exist, to viewing Europe in terms of four freedoms.
Stephen, where are we actually, putting Trump aside, where are we on the Brexit negotiation? What kind of hard, soft, scrambled, what kind of Brexit are we now looking at?
Well, I think part of the problem for businesses planning, for anybody who's trying to work out the impact on their supply or distribution chains, that notwithstanding the narrowing, I think, notwithstanding the picture that Theresa May deliberately or inadvertently painted in her conference speech, the reality is there is still a huge spectrum of potential outcomes on the table. And I think we can probably be fairly confident we're not looking at full continued participation in the internal market, although, if you talk to people in government, they still won't rule it out. Which means that, okay, we're looking at the UK becoming a third country with respect to the single market, access to the single market as opposed to membership of. But even inside that bucket, there's a huge spectrum of potential outcomes, all the way from a hard Brexit with no bilateral treaty arrangements through, a very, very large number of potential mitigants for that kind of harder version of a relationship with the EU. And in the course of next year, probably towards the end of next year, we'll start to get more information about that destination. But the reality is, until we get it, it's quite difficult to plan, and the spectrum of impacts on business continuity is very wide. And I think part of the problem, in fact, with trying to do business continuity planning at the moment is precisely that you're still having to model a huge range of potential futures.
And Rupert, how long do these negotiations take? There's some people who think they can be run in parallel, both the divorce and then the establishing of a new relationship, or is this something that's going to be many years in the making?
I think it will be many years. As I say, I don't think you're going to get any serious negotiation to speak of until probably a year from now. I personally don't see why the rest of the EU should agree to extend the Article 50 process. That's an enormously powerful bargaining chip that they have. That would have to be they'd have to extract quite a lot from the UK in order to do that. I think there is one possibility which is extremely politically painful for the UK government, is to agree a transition phase where the UK continues to pay into the EU budget and continues to apply freedom of movement. But that, i.e., basically freeze the existing arrangement. But I think that's extremely difficult politically for Theresa May to pull off. She may get forced there in the end. But then I do think that the more detailed negotiations on post-exit access are going to take several years after that. I'd agree with where we are. I think that there is a contrast between, you're right, if you speak to people in the government, particularly in the Treasury and some other bits of government, there are still very high ambitions for what we want to achieve. But I think that the early decisions the government has taken and that Theresa May has taken in terms of setting out red lines around immigration and jurisdiction for the ECJ make it very hard to see how those aspirations are achievable. When she said no jurisdiction for the ECJ, there were some people briefing apparently in the background that the EFTA court is different from the ECJ. I'm not sure that politically you could get away with that fine distinction.
And about the economic outlook, both for the UK and Europe at the moment? Obviously, one of the big surprises has been the economy has not fallen off a cliff as many expected. There's not been a recession. But there's a sense that perhaps there's a chronic problem now, that the UK economy might not go straight down, but it's going to sag over a long period of time, and that we'll feel poorer as a result. Is that an accurate call in Goldman's view?
Well, I think the right way to look at the UK's economic outlook is really a question of what are the direct effects of Brexit, and they may be a bit longer to come through elevated uncertainty weighing on business investment, the weakening currency passing through to higher import prices and eroding some consumers' disposable incomes. Those probably are in train over 2 or more years. But it's really a question of what kind of a cushioning effect do you get from certain shock absorbers, I think, that will cushion the impact on activity from the direct effects of Brexit. And those 3 shock absorbers are pretty clearly the weaker currency helping exporters, monetary easing from the Bank of England, we had the package announced in August, and then on top of that, the prospect of looser fiscal policy from the Treasury, and we have the autumn statement later this month. But what I think is most striking, based on this past month's experience, is that maybe the risk to the outlook as a whole is whether those shock absorbers will be able to be used to the full extent possible, because if we have a repeat of this month's experience of a weaker currency and a sell-off in rates on the back of inflation break-evens rising, then that speaks to the possibility that foreign investors are losing a bit of confidence in the UK as well. And that limits how much scope for manoeuvre there is at the Bank of England and at the UK Treasury. And that's why I think last week the Bank of England wasn't able to cut rates and follow through on the guidance that they themselves had given in August, that there'd be another mini rate cut by the end of the year, because they were unsettled by the thought that actually foreign investors are worrying about the UK policy framework. And it's those institutional issues that really pin down the UK outlook, confidence in UK institutions and the central banks, the UK treasuries, ability to respond to any weakening in the outlook. That's what I would pinpoint as a key risk at the moment.
Sorry, Rupert.
I mean, I would agree. I would definitely agree on the Bank of England. I think they didn't want to signal tolerance of further weakness in the currency. But I think if the world plays out as I think the core of the committee still expect, if you do see weakening in investment data and in the labour market, then I wouldn't rule out an extension of QE. I still think that if they feel early next year that they can justify it, I wouldn't rule that out. I think with the Treasury, I think we'll see a very small fiscal loosening in the autumn statement. I mean, I think we almost, it's kind of what we expected, but we almost know it now because apparently Philip Hammond has taken the unusual precedent of telling the Cabinet in advance what might be in the autumn statement.
No splurge.
Which immediately made its way into the FT and other newspapers. That, you know, we're talking about single-figure billions of additional annual spending on infrastructure, which gives you quite a few headlines politically, but doesn't really move the dial from a macro sense. I think the reason for that is not that the Treasury feels constrained by lack of international confidence. I think it's just that genuinely Philip Hammond is a fiscal hawk who still wants to run a balanced budget in several years' time. And if he does need to spend a bit of money to support the economy, he wants to keep that powder dry in case things get worse over the next couple of years.
I'm going to ask another round of questions, and then we'll open it to the floor, where you will ask much smarter questions than me. Stephen, Global Counsel has been involved in advising the banking industry. Where are banks now? The banks have made the case that they would like some kind of transitional agreement. They've also complained in private that the government's perhaps not been as receptive to them as they think is due for an industry that provides so many tax revenues and employment. Yeah, where are the banks, and what strategy do they have for kind of dealing with Brexit?
Well, the first thing to say is that there isn't the banks aren't in any single position. The reality of Brexit for UK-based banks is that it affects every institution differently, and the effect is typically focused on the extent to which you are dependent on passporting right for cross-border trade into the single market, or the extent to which you are plugged into European market infrastructure in such a way, in a way that you're exposed to the dislocation of that infrastructure in some way. And those things mean very different things for a UK domestically focused retail bank and for a London investment bank that's providing capital markets or broker dealer services for a European client base. I mean, the challenge for the banking sector really has been getting to grips with the passporting problem. And the passporting problem is fundamentally that passporting is derives from coverage by the European treaties and coverage by the single European rule book for financial services. You leave the remit of both of those things, you lose your passport. So the challenge for the banking sector and for the government, to the extent that it patronises the banking sector, will be working out whether you can create some analogue for passporting in some form. And the big question, of course, would be what will you base it on? To the extent that, we've heard from European regulators very clearly that any cross-border relationship of that kind has to be based on a set of common rules. Once you have two jurisdictions, the problem of how you create common rules is it's not necessarily intractable, but it's a tricky one. And the problem really is that out there in the kind of world of international trade, cross-border trade in financial services, actual cross-border trade, so selling from one jurisdiction into another, broadly speaking, doesn't happen. So it's not that there's a kind of policy toolbox waiting for us to pick it up and solve the problem. We're going to have to innovate. If it's going to happen, the stuff is going to be genuinely new. So I think, to the extent that the banks are kind of approaching this as a policy problem to solve, that's the thing. The big question, of course, for banks is that if you are going to have to restructure your model in order to ensure that you can keep your passporting rights, that's not something you necessarily can do quickly. It's something that puts a burden on the regulator that regulates you, the customer you're serving, and your own institution. And I think to the extent that there's an appetite for transitional arrangements, it's to make sure that there's enough time for all of those things to happen safely and soundly and in a way that doesn't ultimately result in disruption. But the transition argument is not just about financial services. I think it's actually, it's almost certainly going to be a wider necessity for making this process an orderly one.
Rupert, what's BlackRock's kind of, as a macro-strategist, how do you invest in the current outlook, in an outlook where populism is on the ascent?
Well, we're just sort of currently reassessing whether the night's news makes a difference. I mean, I think that we expected any Trump sell-off to be relatively short-lived. I'm not sure we expect it to be quite as short-lived as it has been. I mean, I think that there is some continuity and some change. I think that the continuity is, the global outlook is, if anything, improving. European data is, if anything, improving. Looks like the global trade cycle is at least, in terms of the second derivative, bottoming out, and there are various causes for optimism. I think that Europe in particular, I think that people will now put a higher premium on political risk. It continues to be an excuse not to allocate risk to Europe. Sometimes not a totally coherent excuse, I think, but nevertheless an excuse. So, for example, people often link, political risk in Italy with the problems in investing in European banks and the resolution of Italian banking situation. There is a linkage, but it's pretty indirect linkage. But nevertheless, it's there as an excuse not to allocate capital to Europe. And I think, therefore, rather unfairly, the crystallization of political risk in the US means that, Brexit started the feeling that political risk was something that was on the radar. This has only elevated it, and therefore Europe needs to, find a way to get past some of those humps before people are going to start allocating significantly more risk to European assets, I suspect.
And Andrew, when you're looking at the continental economy rather than the UK, how much does political risk play? We've had Brexit, now we've got Trump, and now the feeling that it's kind of that move is heading towards Italy and France and Germany over the next year.
Well, the truth is, in our main forecast, it's not playing a very active role at all. I mean, I think the main scope for it to play a role in the forecast would be if it was influencing financial conditions right now. But the fact is, financial conditions are really very easy. Look at asset prices. Asset prices just look rich right now. And above all, that's down to central bank actions. So political risk has to be highlighted, has to be focused on, because it is the key risk to the European outlook. But if that risk doesn't crystallise, it's not really playing a very active role at all in our forecasts as they currently stand.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask, I think there are microphones. If there aren't, if you can raise your hand and introduce yourself if you've got any particular questions for the panel. The gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Peter, and I'm an engineer, and I'm just curious about your opinion about which sectors of British economy might actually benefit from decision of UK leaving EU? Thank you.
Rupert, well, much depends on where we end up. I mean, I think not many is the honest answer. I think that the gains that have been argued about leaving the European Union seem to centre around making free trade deals with other jurisdictions. That's obviously going to take a long time. I think the Prime Minister learned in India that there are issues around freedom of movement that apply even with those kinds of trade deals outside of the European Union. Deregulation is another claim. I think that there are some areas that that the government is certainly looking at. I think, for example, for good or ill, European state aid rules prevent governments from doing various things to support industries that they view as strategic for either political or economic reasons. I think the government will probably start to use, after we are no longer subject to those rules, use that flexibility a little more to be more interventionist in certain sectors. It's difficult to pick in advance what those might be, but probably you would imagine that steel might be one of them, given political sensitivities, but I'm sure there'll be others. I think there are other changes that the government are looking at, for example, in environmental regulation, where you might look to create a more market-based environment and a less technology-specific interventions that you might unwind from Europe. I think that things like Solvency II, there is a huge lobby to change some of the regulatory aspects of investing in infrastructure that come from that. So there are little pockets where you can identify, okay, once the constraints are lifted, we can behave differently. Not all of those are necessarily positive economically over the medium term, but they might be positive for the sectors involved.
Andrew, are there parts of the economy that could do okay?
Well, I think the main sector or group of companies that would be benefiting would be exporters.
Well, sorry, I should have said sterling is the
well, exactly. So it's exporters really that are exporting maybe not to the euro area. And the main reason for that wouldn't be the prospect of free trade deals, it would be because of the weaker currency. And that is what the weaker currency is trying to do. It's trying to compensate for the fact that we'll be losing financial services exports to the euro area. We have a big trade surplus in financial services exports. How do you compensate for that? You have to increase exporters' profit margins to attract resources into that sector of the economy in order to compensate for the loss of some markets. And that is what the weaker currency is basically doing. If I could just pick up on the point that Rupert made about state aid rules. I mean, I think that is an interesting point, and it comes back to this issue of the UK's institutions. I think the implicit assumption that the Leave campaign was making in the run-up to the referendum was that UK institutions are superior to European institutions, and the economy as a whole will benefit from being released from that European red tape or intrusion into our institutions. And I think the worry has to be, and based on that example, for instance, that actually some of those constraints on UK institutions that came from Europe were actually a good thing. If we see state aid being applied to certain sectors, a return to 1970s industrial type policy, I think that will progressively weigh on underlying performance of the UK, and maybe some of those lessons haven't quite been retained, and we risk forgetting those as we go forward.
I think you can, I definitely agree that that's an area where politicians are going to be tempted to experiment, and particularly politicians from the left of the spectrum. But a number of important things have happened since the 70s. The first is that the UK, along with other WTO members, has locked itself into global rules about how you use state aid. The other is, of course, that if we, as a big exporter, if we think we're going to get back into the state aid game, we're going to find ourselves on the other end of things like European anti-dumping measures, which we don't currently think about, but which, to the extent that we were trying to subsidise our steel industry, for example, and then export steel too.
But procurement is a classic example. The government will be much less restricted in choosing UK suppliers, particularly where they are located in sensitive areas, which again may or may not be a good thing.
You can overstate the extent to which the EU actually is a check on those things. I think it functions as a political excuse not to do things.
But these are all examples of protectionism. And the worry, I think, for many thinking of initially Brexit, but also the Trump win overnight, is that these are both basically a verdict on globalization, and as a result, we will see a rise of protectionism. And whether it's state aid rules or it's public sector procurement policies, I think these are basically examples of protectionism, which are quite worrying.
Anyone else with a question from the floor? Gentleman just there.
Marek Gruziński, Capgemini. Actually, I would like to revert this question and ask you if you see that, especially Central and European states, are there extra opportunities which will be, erasing after Brexit?
For them?
For them, yeah.
Can you think of any?
Well, I think at a stretch, to the extent that the UK is currently embedded in manufacturing supply chains within the single market, and it most definitely is. And in fact, the flip side to the sterling value for exporters is that there's obviously a downside as well for UK car manufacturers that rely on imports from the single market for half of their manufactured inputs, the intermediate goods they transform. To the extent that you end up with an outcome which makes it more difficult for the UK to be embedded in those supply chains, then one of the big developments of the last 15 years has been the integration of the Central and Eastern European states into the manufacturing supply chains of Germany in particular. And maybe in a recalibration of those supply chains, there's opportunities there. But of course, to some degree, the British government, and to some degree both sides, I think will actually be working quite hard to maintain those existing supply chain structures.
I think there probably are opportunities also in services. So when we think about financial services activity potentially moving out of London, we think about Dublin or Frankfurt, but actually some of the less high value but still relatively high value activity might move to increasingly locations like Budapest are seen as locations for
things like data processing.
Data processing
Poland
and
has
some
been building a bit of a.
So I think that there are opportunities there, but that's probably accelerating a move that's already happening.
And politically, maybe the opportunity is to take the seat that's being vacated by the UK as being that advocate of liberalisation in Europe and be a partner for Germany in advancing that case in Europe. I think there could be business opportunities that would follow from that, but actually maybe for a Central Eastern European country, a group of them, potentially a country like Spain, I think, has that opportunity, if it rises to the occasion, on the back of having reformed, and becomes an advocate of liberalisation, given that Germany right now is looking around Europe, and I think looking for that voice that will replace the role that the UK has traditionally played in that respect.
Germany certainly doesn't want to do it itself.
Gentleman at the front, and then perhaps one more person after that, so if there's one more.
Just to the point of advantage for Central Eastern. Point of advantage for Central Eastern Europe, Maciej Olek-Szczytowski from Warsaw. The raging advantage, if there is any erosion of free movement, will surely be the end of the massive subsidy, free subsidy from Central Eastern Europe, which free movement has represented for the benefit of the importing countries. 8 million people have been sucked out of Central Eastern Europe thanks to the absurdity of the free movement doctrine, and any erosion of that, any closing of the UK market, any erosion elsewhere in the Germanys of this world and in the Scandinavias can only be to the massive medium-term and long-term benefit of Central Eastern Europe, especially as demographic crisis is galloping into these countries at a vast pace.
Although not necessarily the individuals concerned.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Not necessarily the individuals concerned who are looking for opportunities elsewhere.
Yes, but macroeconomically it's been a disaster. It's been a disaster, and it's been a unilateral subsidy, as I say, from Central and Eastern Europe, from Romania, from Poland and these other countries, to the benefit of the UK, Germany, Scandinavia and elsewhere. That's the fact of it, and a fact that is increasingly, I think, being recognised.
One more question from the floor. There is one. No? Well, I will take the advantage of a captive audience to promote the Bloomberg Brexit Bulletin, which is in your in trays by 8 a.m. in the morning, thanks to a couple of us who get up before dawn to tap it out. You can access it via the website. And that just leads me to thank Stephen and Rupert and Andrew for their insights, and to wish you a pleasurable remainder of the conference. Thank you very much.